Today's conversation with Melanie Humphreys. Melanie is the CEO of Horizon 7. Mel used to be my boss many moons ago when we worked together in a tech sales organization, but she now runs a business that helps IT, CIOs and CTO types to procure technology solutions in a more agile and intelligent way. And she's got some absolutely fantastic insights for sellers from a buyer's perspective. So you're not going to want to miss this one. Let's get into the conversation.
We were talking before we started recording about your journey over the last few years and how you've gone from very much like a sales background into this kind of world that's I suppose more supply side, but somewhere in between. So I'm really interested. So what made you want to go on that journey, and what did you expect you'd find, and what have you actually found? I suppose the big things I'm interested in getting in understanding, Mel.
So whilst looking back, it seems like a really logical journey. And when I tell the story, it seems really logical, but it wasn't planned at all. So I spent 25 years working in the IT supplier community in various roles, sales leadership roles, also commercial leadership roles. And I used to spend a lot of time incredibly frustrated, not just with the internal behaviour of the supplier organisations I worked for, but in the behaviour in the market. And that frustration came from arm's length processes where we as a supplier didn't have the ability to demonstrate the real differences we could bring to the table, or the benefits of the culture of our organisation and how that would work with the supplier, the client organisation. I got incredibly frustrated with how those processes drove a price point really low, but drove a really bad response from the supplier organisations that I worked for, and set up those relationships to fail in many situations, because as a supplier organisation, we were given horrendous terms and conditions and negotiated really low price points over an elongated period of time. So it took a long while too. And the client organisation, through all of that, yes, perhaps they saw they got a great price point, but what they got was a very frustrated supplier organisation, a bunch of execs in that supplier organisation that felt like they'd got a pretty rubbish deal, really. And there wasn't a lot of flexibility in that deal to deliver fab service and delight the customer. So all in all, whether the clients actually felt that at the end of the day, what was going on behind the scenes in the supplier organisation were all of those things. So I spent a long while, whilst running the sales or commercial teams, just being frustrated that there had to be a better way. And near the end of that part of my career, I ended up being involved in a procurement process that was run by a not-for-profit organisation, but they used Horizon 7, a consulting firm, to come in and do the procurement process. And it was done in an entirely different way. And being a supplier in that process, I sat there thinking, this is the kind of process that the market needs to use when they go to market to buy technology or tech services. But the second thing I felt while I was going through that process was, as a supplier organisation, we weren't organised in a way that we could respond to that kind of procurement process. So whilst it was everything that I dreamed and wished for, we weren't organised in a way that we could respond really well. And it felt really awkward, uncomfortable, painful, difficult, all of those things, because we had been taught by the industry to respond to requirements in a certain way. And this was turning that way upside down on its head. And so I ended up joining that company, ultimately, Horizon 7. What did I expect to find? I tell you what I expected to find. I expected to find that more organisations were already operating in this way, and by this way, a more modern procurement approach. Because the one thing that is pretty true for anyone working in tech or tech services is that the rate of change and the pace of change in our environment is rapid, and it is ever increasing, and technology is getting more and more complicated and difficult to buy. So therefore, that rate of change needs us to buy quicker, faster, more efficiently. So what I was surprised to find when I came to represent clients rather than sell to clients was, I expected to find an industry that was open to change and was already changing because of all of these things. But unfortunately not. I didn't find that at all. What I found is a world of buyer client organizations that are still operating the way they probably operated 10, 15, 20 years ago, even before cloud computing, and a supplier world that is still used to supplying in that way.
Just incredible. So you've got this, because you're absolutely right, the rate of change is just crazy, and we all know that. Like, I've worked for organizations, so I've worked for an organization that was an AI consultancy, and we talked a great game to customers, and there was real capability in it, but internally we ran on spreadsheets. So every organization's that kind of loosely functioning business that just happens to make money, and sometimes some businesses make more money than others. It's fascinating. And so where do you start then when you engage with a client who says, you know what, we're not doing this, help us change? Where do you start?
That's a very good question. In the perfect world, we would start by all of the stakeholders that need this thing and understanding their desired outcomes from a business perspective. People always get tied up with functional requirements and things like that. Forget that. What are you trying to achieve? Why are you doing this? And typically that would be CIO, CTO, COO, CFO. You may end up with a chief marketing officer or people officer, depending on what the products and services are. But you'd sit down, understand from that group of stakeholders, what are you trying to achieve through this thing that you're going to buy, and get all of those stakeholders on the same page, because often that isn't the case when someone goes to market to buy a thing. So stakeholders aligned with what the North Star for that activity or that thing is. So let's align everyone, first of all. The second thing that is often missing is a business case. And I find it very surprising in this day and age that organizations are still going to market to buy a thing without understanding a business case. Now, where I just articulated sitting down with the stakeholders, typically being C-level people, the business case would normally sit at that level as well. What we find in our world, in a non-perfect world, is that organizations come to market, suppliers respond to those opportunities, but often that's being done at a lower level in the organization without the higher levels knowing. And so therefore, those activities often end in nothing, or what they can also end in is a shifting right of times. And for the supplier, that feels like a deal shifting right. For a customer, that feels like a project shifting right. But in any circumstance, it shifts right. So aligning the desired business outcomes and aligning the business case means you can go to market in a coordinated way, knowing the outcomes you're going to get and the way you're going to spend the money to get them. Without those two things, your process, I'm going to go as far as to say your process will fail. Whatever fail means to you and whichever lens you failure through, it will fail. So that is where you have to start. And that is also where you have to end at the end. Have we gone to market and have we found a product and services that are going to meet or exceed our desired outcomes? And do they fit the envelope of the business case, or are they better? Do they get us more than the business case asked for? That's how you start and end and work out whether or not you've done what you were supposed to do and whether the supplier or suppliers can help you as a customer achieve your desired outcomes.
That's really, because it mirrors when I work with clients and I talk about how you sell your product or service. A lot of the time, nobody really cares about your product and service. They care about the outcome. They care about the change, the delta that they want to see within their business. And I often talk a lot, and because I've seen it a lot, where buying decisions they start as emotional decisions. They start as status-based decisions that have business cases or metrics retrofitted into them a lot of the time. An IT director will want to work with a certain vendor because they're their favorites. They'll figure out how they can make it. Or I've seen CIOs who want to have a cloud migration on their CV so they can go and get the next job. Or if you go back 10 years, 15 years, it was a big outsource, wasn't it, as well? So you see a lot of that. So I'm guessing you see, and keep me honest, you see a lot of kind of, when I think about the different sort of individuals involved, you've got people above the power level, those kind of C-suite individuals, and then people who sit below or on the margins of the power level, so maybe a head of IT or an IT director. You see a lot of IT directors or directors kind of spending their budget on the things they want because they have a budget, so they run an RFP, and then they take the kind of above the line, and the exec or the C-suite look at it and go, well, what are we actually doing here? What are you actually trying to achieve? Is that the size of it, or have I kind of misunderstood?
It's exactly the size of it. And I think depending on the size of the organization, it does differ. We work for some really big organizations and some really small ones. In the smaller ones, and in all instances, the tech or the tech services are critical to enable something. But in the ones where we are sitting down with the C-suite, these are career defining, they are job defining, they are company defining moments, a lot of these decisions, because the thing we're involved with is normally part of a significant transformation or cost savings or something which is going to drive that organization forwards in some way. So it is critical that the most senior people have an awareness of the thing that's happening, they're bought into it, and that it's an enabler for the things they're trying to achieve. We work with a fair amount of not-for-profits, but we also work with some big media brands, some big energy firms, and they're all very different in terms of the size of turnover, but all of them have critical tech projects. And we will, whilst we are not a supplier organization selling that tech, we still push as hard as we can to get as senior as we can in that organization to make sure that when we run a process, we want to deliver great outcomes for our clients, right? And we want to deliver great outcomes for the industry via the supplier community. So if we aren't clear on what those desired outcomes are, we can't achieve what we say we will in the first instance, let alone find a supplier that can help. It's super important we're aligned with the most senior stakeholders for the project and the thing that needs to be bought, because if we're not, we won't meet, we will be unsuccessful. And our brand as an organization is built on delivering great outcomes and having a great reputation in the industry. Our process relies heavily on the supplier organizations leaning in to the process and being the best they can be. So if we built a reputation for projects that didn't deliver, then we would struggle with that as well. So it always comes back down to those two things. And if I reflect back on my time working in supplier organizations, I wished I'd known then what I know now, because I would do my job very differently. But those two things, if you are not aligned at the most senior level, most senior stakeholder level, if you don't know what those desired outcomes are for the business, and if there is no business case underpinning them, then you are really going to struggle to sell your thing and to deliver for the client organization. Because even if you get your contract signed, you will end up with delivery challenges because your client isn't clear on what they're buying and why they're buying it. This is 57% of IT projects fail, right? They fail to meet the desired outcomes. And that's not because anyone's rubbish or it's not a great product or service. It's because you didn't align properly on what you were going to achieve through that project. So it's critical.
You said a couple of really interesting things that I'm going to circle back on in a minute, but I'm really conscious that we talked about you get your outcomes you're trying to achieve, you get your business case, and those are your foundation pillars. What are the next steps in your process and your approach once you have those?
Our next step would be there's a few things actually. Number one is to work out at a high level understanding requirements for the client. So this is where it does get a little bit more sleeves up, a little bit more on the ground. But again, in these processes, what typically everyone focuses in on is functional requirements. What's the thing? Being really dictatorial about the thing I want. And unfortunately, most client organizations aren't specialists in these things. So quite often they'll write really stringent requirements which clip the supplier's wings in being able to be creative. So we try and get high level requirements, functional requirements. But the other things that organizations often don't think about when they go to market, that non-functional requirements, often they'll think about that, but probably not in a lot of detail. So they won't necessarily get all of the architecture team involved or the CISO, things like that. But the other elements, so I would put those in a bucket of solution. The other two elements that often aren't really thought about enough at the beginning of this kind of process is the commercial model, not price. Everyone always focuses in on price. What's the commercial model? Because your unit price points might be expensive or cheap, but the commercial model they sit within is the thing that the client really is buying into. And contractuals. We fundamentally disagree with leaving the contractual discussion to the end of the process when you've selected the supplier. Why would you start a beautiful relationship with an argument? Number one. Number two, with a client lens on, why would I not use competitive tension to get better contractual points through the process, so that when I get to the end, I'm making my decision on solution, commercials, and contractuals. How easy are they going to be to work with contractually, etc. So that's the next phase. We sit down and we understand what all of the functional, non-functional, commercial, and contractual requirements are. At the same time, so that's with the client, that's what we're busy doing with them. At the same time, we're starting to look at the market. We're saying, what will probably disappoint the supplier community? And I never realized this when I was in the supplier communities. Everyone can mostly do the same thing. It's how they do it that differentiates them and who does it. Working out of the world of suppliers that can do that thing, who taking the world down a funnel to 3 or 4 that are the right organizations to go into a more intimate process with. So those are the things we're doing at that next stage, going from a long to short list of suppliers that are appropriate for the project and the client, and building out requirements. And the interesting thing I often say here, so a lot of people listening to your podcast, Gavin, are probably going to be in the sales community. What I probably hadn't appreciated when I was on the sales side was all of the interactions at this stage with your client matter, whether there's a third-party advisor in like us or whether it's the client. Every interaction, every email, every phone conversation, every NDA interaction, the client is starting to build a position on how well they could work with you, how well aligned your organizations could be. And I don't think I fully appreciated, perhaps subconsciously I did before, but consciously I didn't. So every time back in my past, we made it really difficult to sign an NDA because I'd take it back in-house and legal would make a load of changes. Every time I went back to that customer with red lines, I was proving to them that I was going to be quite difficult to do business with. So that's when I look at a salesperson's lens on this process. Every stage of a procurement process, think about your behavior and how you're engaging.
And that's fantastic. That's such a great insight. So there was 2 things. So let's do this one first. So you mentioned a little while ago that you do things a whole lot differently if you knew what you know now back when you were on the sales side as a sales leader and a commercial leader. What are the top 3 or 5? You've intimated one in terms of making sure every interaction is a good interaction, making sure that you're an easy business to do business with. Is it worth expanding on that, or have you said what you need to say on that, and there are a few others that you'd highlight?
Okay, so what would I do differently? When I talked about those desired outcomes, I've established that a lot of the time clients haven't really done that piece of work, right? Even when there has been good stakeholder engagement, they've typically not sat down and coordinated themselves in that way. So how can you as a supplier or a salesperson go, well, if they've not done that, how is the process going to work? You can do it for them, right? We sit down and quite often clients don't know how to start with desired outcomes. So we will give them a starter for 10. And that is picking up the breadcrumbs of what you can find out about them in the industry, their annual report, their website. You can pick out the things that are business level or strategic imperatives, critical for them. You may find out that behind the scenes, there's been a data breach or something like that, which means you would have thought security, things like that are top of mind. So you have the ability to give this a stab actually as a salesperson. So give it a go. Give it a go at drafting what a desired outcome would be. And typically they're very high level strategic initiatives, and underpinning that there would be a measure of how that could be achieved through this process. You could probably draft 3 for a prospect or a client just by what's publicly available. We're in a fantastic world now where lots of stuff is available. So I do that. If they don't exist, write them yourself. Use it as part of a qualification process. and use it to show yourself as a thought leader, as someone who really who even if you may not get it 100%, you'll get it more right than not having it there at all. So that would be the first thing. But what that drives it to is qualify better and harder. I'd probably end up qualifying out of 50% of things that perhaps before we qualified in, and I would change qualification criteria if I ran a sales organization now. I think we look at qualification through a bit of an old-fashioned lens now. I would qualify a bit differently. The other thing I'd do differently as well, and this is slightly different because it doesn't it's not a new logo play, but if I was a client partner and I had existing accounts, I would be thinking about how I would renew them almost as soon as I sign them. Because your clients, the further your relationship separates through term, the harder it will be for you to renew them and for them to justify why they should just renew with you rather than go to market again. And no one's got time on their side anymore. You as an incumbent, if you're delivering a great service, why should they go somewhere else? If you start that relationship with the theory of it's a relationship for life, a partnership for life, and manage it that way in life, that renewal becomes a much easier process for you, and it will help your client to not go to market. Now, they might need to benchmark you to demonstrate value, but the client won't want to do a long go-to-market process if they're already fairly happy with you. So that's probably the third thing I would say. Think about how you're going to renew once you sign them as a new logo, because only thinking about renewal 6 months before the renewal is due is the wrong time. I've watched so much of that now, and it's not great for anyone. And in an industry that needs to move fast, if you've got a great partnership already, make it easy for that client to renew with you. Don't be scared. Don't be afraid.
Yeah. It's so interesting how when I look at what the kind of the gold standard, the sort of, exemplar examples of great sales work actually align with a lot of what you said in terms of helping an organization to actually understand, well, what are we trying to achieve here? How do we build a business case around it? How do we get everyone together? So it's almost like, call me crazy, but you're on the same side, the supplier and the customer, basically on the same side, trying to achieve the same thing. So there's this natural coming together that could happen that just doesn't. So and I often see, one of the things I say to people who I've worked with or I coach around things like performance improvement plans, I said, there's two kinds of pit. There's the pit where they really want you to stay and just going to do everything with you to keep you. And there's the pit where they're trying to manage you out. I think RFP processes are sometimes the same, where there's kind of two types of RFP process. There's an RFP process that is, we genuinely are looking for somebody new, or we're genuinely open to this. And then there's the kind of RFP that is like, it's written for our current supplier just because we want to keep the supplier. But from what you've said, I'm starting to think maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's just there's a level of ignorance going into the writing of those RFPs that then puts the seller on the back foot. So that coming together just structurally is always going to be a challenge.
I think so. We don't use RFPs. We don't believe written documents like that are the right way to buy complicated services. That's a subject for a different podcast. But when we have worked with suppliers, helping them to respond to RFPs, because we do a lot of bid coaching, so we act like CIO or CPO in the room, and or if we have clients who come to us and say, we want you to help run our process, but it's our process, our documents, what have you. So we do see RFPs then. What you will see behind the scenes typically is an RFP is 10 different people who've thrown all their stuff into a pot. Someone's glued them all together into a Word document, and then that's gone to market. And they haven't necessarily thought about how it's going to be evaluated, who's going to evaluate it, whether or not joined up it makes sense, what that end goal is when you get all those responses in. And what you feel as a supplier community is you read the RFP and go, it doesn't make sense, and then you're thrown into an arm's length process where there's no collaboration and engagement to try and turn that into something better. And what you then do is you answer all the questions within the rules, and then you submit a price, and then you might get called in to do presentations, and it all feels very much like an exam, which doesn't drive the right outcome for anyone. I think we assume there's a lot more thought that's gone into a lot of those RFPs than actually does, unfortunately. And quite often it's the same RFP that gets the dust brushed off. Yeah. Most of it's the same, and there might be one section around requirements that's been updated by someone in a technical function. And I'm exaggerating for effect, because some are run better than that, right? But often that is the case. And often they're not even RFPs, they're RFIs really. And we sometimes get brought in by clients who say, we've run an RFP process, but we don't know how to make a decision. And then we get involved and we say, you've run an RFI process, you've got a bunch of information, but you've got no way, there's nothing that you can evaluate. Or you haven't thought about writing the RFP in the way you need to evaluate. So I think, coming back to my point around helping customers with desired outcomes, I think it's really easy as a salesperson to think my customer knows exactly what they want and how they're going to get it. Often they don't. And often procurement people are in a function where they don't necessarily understand the tech that they're actually going to market to buy. And one of the reasons you're kept at arm's length as supplier organizations is they don't really understand that much about it, and they want to adhere to these mythical rules. And these mythical rules only really exist in public sector or regulated processes. They don't have to exist in commercial processes. You can still run a robust, fair, appropriate process without it being arm's length. I think we need to assume that those RFPs aren't written necessarily with any end in mind, that they're just written and they go out there and it's a way of collating information and evaluating. I would, if I was a supplier in one of those processes now, I'd go back to what I said earlier. Every single engagement, don't be afraid to challenge it and try and be their friend and try and encourage them to do it differently to get a better outcome. And think that in every engagement with every person, you are being evaluated all the way through.
And there's two things you talked about a minute ago. One of the things you do differently if you knew what you know now back then would be qualify better and harder. And you also talked about, as you go through the process with your clients nowadays, you look for kind of the right organization, how you can, because and I agree, it's a lot of the time everyone can do everything. Most people can do most things quite well. It's about trying to find the right organization. So I suppose the question is on both sides of that coin. Is one is, you talked about qualifying completely differently. How would you look at qualification now versus how the industry tends to do it? And then on the flip side of that, again, how do you look at qualification in terms of finding the right organization for the client to be able to deliver what the outcome that you're looking for?
I'll take the second one first. So we evaluate all the work. So when we get into that smaller set of suppliers where we're using a series of structured workshops, we are evaluating the content of that workshop. So it could be, if it's a D365 project, we could be evaluating the finance capabilities within the platform. But every single workshop, we're evaluating ways of working and culture.
Okay.
And we sit down with the client and we say, what does a good supplier relationship look like to you? Explain to us what that's like today with a great supplier. And then let's pull out those things that are important and let's evaluate these suppliers against those things. And by the way, we're going to tell the suppliers how we're evaluating them. It's not a dark art. We want them to know. And every single workshop, the stakeholders in that workshop, client side, will evaluate what they're seeing around the functional capability of the platform, but they will also evaluate how that organization is to work with in that session. So we're building up a view with data supporting it of what are the capabilities, functional, non-functional, of the supplier, but also all the way through, what are the ways of working and culture and how does that align to us? So you may end up at the end with you may have had a suboptimal performance in the workshop around commercials, for example, but all the way through, you may have had an exemplary score around ways of working and culture. That's going to really be differentiating. On the flip side, if you are functionally fantastic, but you are constantly the lowest on culture and ways of working. And I can't mention any names here, but there are organizations that always are. That's a really difficult decision for the organization to make, because they will be making a decision. And so if you're buying an off-the-shelf product that's a one-time, maybe you can tolerate that, right? Because you've not got to have a not long relationship with them. But if you're choosing an SI to deliver a whole new ERP platform, then you are going to want to have a long-term great relationship. So if that score is poor, you've got to think about, why is it poor, and are they the right organization to work with? And the likelihood is, the end of the process, they won't win. So I come back to, you could have the best salesperson in the world, but if the organization and the people around them aren't the right fit for the client, in our process, they won't win. And when I fold that, so that's how we qualify around culture, ways of working, and score, and make it consistent. If I think about qualification processes, that business case thing is really important. If I know it sounds really basic, but if they can't talk to you about a business case and imperatives for the project, you've got to just question whether this is ever going to happen. And it might seem really difficult, and it might seem the sexiest deal ever, and you really want it on, you really could do your number and all the rest of it. But if there isn't, if the people you're engaging with can't articulate things at that level, the likelihood is it's not been signed off and it's not going to happen. And one of the things I really dislike, we might disagree on this, by the way, Gavin, but it's my personality type, right? I don't like the challenger sale. I can feel like when it's being done to me, right? I think this is something else that I would think about when I think about, if I was running a sales team again, I would be thinking about who's the right person to put on this deal culturally, because one size doesn't fit all. And we have been in situations where we have said, you are doing great as an organization, but the salesperson is losing you this deal because the customer cannot bear them, cannot bear how they treat their colleagues, cannot bear how they show up, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are some fundamentals that I would just sit and think about. And it might be a difficult decision as a sales leader to change that salesperson on that account because they found the leader, what have you, but you've got to think about the alignment with the customer culture.
That's fascinating. So I have written at the top of my pads here when I'm making notes, challenger methodology ? Because it's interesting, what you've described is almost in client organizations or companies you're selling to, you've described almost what the authors of the challenger sale would say was the perfect environment, because you can go in, you can teach, tailor, take control. But I tend to agree, I don't really like the challenger sale either. I think it's a bit...
It gives me the ick.
Yeah, exactly. It is the ick. I think it's a bit pushy. I think it's a tiny bit arrogant. I just don't think it gets executed very well. It's part of the problem. And it's more of a lot of what the challenger sale, if you look at it, really starts with is actually content marketing to create the thought leadership bit. So that desired outcomes thing you talked about earlier on, that's a lot of what the challenger sale leads to. But actually, that's not how it gets executed a lot of the time. A lot of time people come in and go, I'll tell you what to do. But I do believe that sales is an act of leadership. So there is the onus on the salesperson to take some kind of leadership role, both within their own organization to bring together the kind of right people, but also within the client to help ask the right questions, provide the right kind of levels of insight and support. So it makes me wonder, what is it about the challenger sale that creates the ick? And maybe it's just because we've overused the terms too much. Maybe it's because people apply it in the wrong way. But I am same as you. I get that creepy feeling when people start to use the challenger sale as well.
So I think what it does to me is it makes me feel inadequate when it's used on me, because it has been done in a way that makes me feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, because I should know this and I should have done this, and have you thought of that? And all that does is make me think, oh, maybe I should have done, oh God, maybe I'm really crap. And I think it's been done to me clumsily. So I think, showing up as a thought leader, we both know someone who used to use the expression student of your industry. I'm a fully paid up member of that club now. Mm-hmm. It is very obvious when people walk into a room. So what does good from a salesperson perspective look like when you're running a process like we run? Good looks like someone who is a great team member, who clearly has the respect and collaboration of their organization. People aren't frightened of them, but they're respectful of them, but they're really good, supportive leaders and supporters at the same time. They have a really engaging way with the client in an authentic way. And they have really thought about the client and become a student of the industry and that particular client. And I always talk about, there's one experience that I've had since I've been at Horizon 7 with one particular sales director from one particular type of organization, who he and his team were phenomenal. They positioned themselves as leaders from the get-go. They went at this hard, with authenticity, with knowledge, with every single thing that the client was looking for and we were looking for. They personified it, exemplified it, every engagement, every time we saw them. And they did win. And there was a part in the end where there was a very big technical problem with their solution that they overcame calmly with a really creative way of overcoming the solution. And they won. And they're delivering now for the client, and they're doing a phenomenal job. The client has no second thoughts, loves working with them. And I messaged the CEO after the process had been finished, contracts had been signed and delivery had started. And I said, I just want you to know your sales director ran one of the best campaigns I've ever been part of or seen in my entire career. And I just think you should know he's a keeper and the team around him are great. And you know what? He got a promotion. I saw it on LinkedIn about a month afterwards. He got a promotion. I'd like to take credit for that, but probably was something to do with the fact he'd done a really good job for a long while. But it is, you can feel the difference. And that comes from, he as a person was really bought. He loved his job. You could tell it. He loved the prospect. He loved what he did. But he was well supported by his organization as well, really well supported. And I think that is a cultural thing, isn't it? You can tell, I work with a lot of suppliers where you can tell that is not the case. And they make their internal problems the customer's problem. They make their internal timelines, quarter, month end, year end, they make that the customer's problem. And I will say to people all the time, don't make your internal problems the customer's. We think when we're salespeople, we aren't doing that. I'd like to personally think I make sure I don't let that happen, even now when I'm engaging with clients. But an awful lot of people do, and that is a massive turnoff and a massive black mark in a process. Because what you're doing is you're sharing your dirty laundry with the customer, and you're also making it their problem. Why should it be? So that would be another tip from the top. A salesperson has to hire a salesperson or the account team or the deal team, whoever. If there are some challenges internally with getting stuff done, don't make that someone else's problem. It's yours.
I'm conscious of time, but this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, absolutely packed full of insight and value. So thank you so very much. Are there any kind of final thoughts or final things you'd like to share? And then maybe you can tell us a bit about where we can find you and Horizon 7.
That's a really good question. Two quick things. Number one, we use Covey's 7 habits of highly successful people as the sort of backbone of how we operate as individuals. But it translates really well to a sales world. And you mentioned something earlier, think win and be open about the win. We as supplier organizations want things out of a deal. Clients want things out of a deal. Let's put those all on the table. Let's talk about what the win is, because that's how good contracts, deals, commercials get structured, rather than people just looking at it one-dimensionally. So that would be the first thing. Think about the win. Second thing would be, from a sales perspective, irrespective of whether you think sales is an art or a science or a bit of both, be authentic. People do buy from people. If you show up as something anything other than who you really are, then it won't land well. People, just be you. And if you work for a company where you can't be you, maybe you should think about the company you're working for. And I think that's quite important, because if your job is sales and you're business to business type sales environment, it's super important, because it doesn't matter whether you're selling to HSBC or a not-for-profit down the road. So people are making decision about the people in your organization. So just be really authentic. That's you as a salesperson, but also your team. Be authentic. So those would be two things. I'm Melanie Humphreys. You can find me on LinkedIn, and Horizon 7, which is the consulting firm that I'm the CEO of. Our website is really simple, www.horizon7.co.uk, and my email address is really simple as well, Melanie, Melanie, at horizon7, 2 words, .co.uk.
Fantastic. And I'll put all of that in the show notes so that everybody's got that. Mel, thank you so much. It's been amazing. I'm going to hit stop recording. Where's that stop recording button gone? There we go. Stop recording.